Welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar sponsored by E+ELeader, a software solutions company. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team, I welcome you to using objective data and insights to navigate the subjective world of ESG for a competitive edge. We welcome you today from wherever you are joining us in the world. Hopefully we can get through this whole event without one or all three of my dogs barking. So I am gonna give a little disclaimer there at the beginning. Questions specific to the presentation, as well as any technical questions, please submit using the Q&A widget that is open on your screen. The attendee chat widget is there for you to converse with other attendees, share where you are joining us from, as well as why you decided to jump on with us today. We have provided a few resources for all attendees, as well as a call to action button where you can submit a product or project of the year for E+ELeader. This program is an annual program, and it does close in 14 days. And something new, if you were on with us yesterday, something new for 2023, we are providing, E+ELeader that is providing a certificate of attendance for all attendees meeting the specific criteria. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Trevor Bronson, Director of Portfolio Strategy for ESG. He will be presenting today, and he's going to be joining us Friday for our ESG Roundtable. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Trevor, and I will rejoin everybody for the Q&A. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and a big thank you to Environment and Energy Leader for having ESG today and helping us do this webinar for everyone attending. Welcome to everyone attending the webinar from wherever you are in the world, whether you're with me in North America or maybe even in Europe or anywhere else. I appreciate everyone's time and attention today, and I hope that you come out of this hour, maybe even a little less, a little more knowledgeable and a little more excited for the opportunity that ESG will provide than when you came into it. So without further ado, a little bit about ESG before we jump into the meat of today's session for anyone unfamiliar. At ESG, we empower organizations to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex marketplace while driving cleaner, safer, more efficient operations. We do this by developing web and mobile applications that streamline and simplify environment, ESG, safety, and quality management. Our software solutions help companies around the world ensure compliance, reduce risk, and improve performance. You can see on the infographic on the right, this is a representative showing of our offerings in the areas that we cater to. This is by no means all-inclusive, but it does show the core elements, the health and safety part of our portfolio, the quality part of our portfolio, and the environment and sustainability or ESG part of our portfolio, all underpinned by the platform where we have our BI tools, risk management tools, workflow management tools, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, I could talk about ESG for a while. Let's jump into the numbers. We were founded in 1992, so we just celebrated our 30th birthday last year, actually. We have approximately 1,400 clients and growing. That's 24% of the firms listed in the top 50 of the Fortune 500, as well as a lot of mom and pop shops. So we really focus on being able to serve a wide range of different type of clients for their needs. Within those 1,400 clients are 5 million happy users, and making those 5 million users happy are 500 happy employees, meaning we have the resources to serve, support, and innovate at every step of the way across our 4 global offices in North America, Asia, and Europe in the UK. But don't take it just from me. Of course, you expect me to say positive things about ESG. You could take it from other independent organizations that have recognized us for our achievements. On the product side of things, we were honored to be named a leader in the recent Verdantix Green Quadrant for EHS software, making it our 5th report in a row, I believe. We were named as a leader. From the folks here in Environment and Energy Leader, we won a 2022 Top Product of the Year award, a Sustainability Award in 2021. Then we also have some workplace awards. I'm going to be talking to you, of course, today about ESG, about sustainability. I want you to know that at ESG and at Fortive, our parent company, we practice what we preach. So we have a silver medal from EcoVadis, as well as other awards for our talent retention and places to work in general. So, okay, let's jump into today's presentation, why you are all here to hear me speak for the next 50 minutes or so. First, we'll talk about how to define ESG for your organization. Then we'll talk about tools and techniques to drive smarter ESG decisions. And we'll close it up with how ESG is changing the roles and responsibilities of EHS professionals. This is a talk track I really like to think about often and make sure I can talk about as much as I get the chance, because I think it's really important for EHS professionals, which I'm sure make up a large portion of today's audience, to understand what exactly this buzz about ESG and sustainability means for them, their professional development, their careers moving forward, and more importantly, their responsibilities in their day-to-day. So without further ado, how to define ESG for your organization. So first of all, it's important to understand that ESG really lacks a consensus definition, right? It's a super broad concept. It means a lot of different things to different people, depending on what your role in the ESG universe is, how you're thinking about it, and why you're thinking about it. So I went on the internet and just looked at different definitions that I could find to understand how, again, this is all from the first page of Google here, basically how these definitions vary. So Investopedia defines ESG as a set of standards for a company's behavior used by socially conscious investors to screen potential investments. TechTarget, on the other hand, calls ESG a term used to represent an organization's corporate financial interests that focus mainly on sustainability and ethical impacts. Okay, interesting. Now let's hear from maybe an expert on ESG, MSCI, or Morgan Stanley Capital Investments. ESG is the consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors alongside financial factors in the investment decision-making process. Gartner tells us that ESG is a collection of corporate performance evaluation criteria that assess the robustness of a company's governance mechanisms and its ability to effectively manage its environmental and social impacts. That's a lot of word salad. Finally, I asked ChatGPT what it thought about ESG, and it told me that it's a set of criteria that investors use to evaluate the sustainability and ethical impact of investments. So a lot of different ways to say a similar thing, but we're using different words and again, focusing on different audiences, right? So what jumps out between these 5 definitions is that ESG is really focused on a financial audience to give them more data points, more information so that they can make educated decisions based on how they want to operate their portfolios, right? Some may be more risk averse, some may want to take more risks, some may be very focused on only investing in companies with a certain ESG score, or only investing in companies that at least have considerations towards the ESG of it all when it comes to their operations. But fundamentally, the emergence of ESG is because you're seeing a higher demand for folks with capital to use ESG related information to make decisions with said capital, whether that be in search of higher returns or in search of a more ethical or noble, if you will, approach to what they're doing with their money. But again, there's no consensus definition, right? There's no lock on exactly what ESG is. And that's important because ESG is and will likely remain such a broad concept. But the basics are agreed upon. So I took a stab at a definition myself because of course I did. ESG refers to the management of and mitigation of risks associated with a company's environmental, social, and governance-related impacts on its stakeholders resulting from its ongoing operations. I feel this gives a bit of leeway to the financial community as well as to corporations, entities, et cetera, that are focusing on improving their ESG metrics for the sake of doing it because it's, quote unquote, the right thing to do, or trying to think about how their operations impact their communities, societies, stakeholders, the world at large moving forward. Under the 3 core pillars, ESG, of course, environmental, social, and governance. Environment typical represents things like carbon emissions, water stress, hazardous waste, et cetera. The social pillar of ESG is health and safety, supply chain labor, privacy and security, community relations, and then governance covers things like ownership structure, executive pay, tax transparency, and so on and so forth. Of course, for this audience today, we'll be talking mainly about the environmental pillar and the social pillar as it pertains specifically to health and safety, supply chain labor, maybe even product quality. But now that we're all level set on what ESG really represents, let's think about knowing that ESG is fundamentally data used to make decisions. We need to know where we're getting that data from. And here is where the picture continues to remain, clear as mud. Different companies that provide ESG ratings or ESG numbers for entities looking to make decisions based off of those numbers have their own ingredients to what makes up an ESG score. So MSCI, for example, under the environmental pillar, they have carbon emissions, product carbon footprint emissions, climate change vulnerability. On social, they have the aforementioned health and safety, broad labor management, human capital development, very broad term again, and the governance one is a bit smaller. But here, I believe I counted this yesterday, and there were 36 different categories that go into their ESG score. So let's compare that to someone else, like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, another provider of ESG ratings for companies. Here, I believe there's 31 categories represented, which are similar, but vary because we have more of a focus on environmental compliance. We have a focus on environmental opportunities, aspects and impacts, if you will, which brings us back to the ISO 14001 language. focus on natural resources and water management, material sourcing. We have a big section on human capital again. Interestingly enough, Dun & Bradstreet files health and safety under the broad human capital category. We even have cyber risk under social. And then governance, it's a little more limited than MSCI's is, but very similar. One interesting thing is their focus on business resilience. This is all to say that the way ESG scores are calculated after what a company is doing to increase or even establish a baseline as its performance can be very different. And look, even if it seems simple, so here's S&P Global's rating formula. So they have these three dimensions, the governance and economic dimension. So they added an extra E to the ESG acronym. They have the environmental dimension and the social dimension. You can see, I believe this was about 30 categories here as well. And you think, okay, well, Trevor, that looks a little simpler. Maybe we should be submitting to S&P or making sure we work a lot with them. Well, within these 30 odd categories, this is what it actually looks like. This is the questionnaire that gets sent around to make those categories up, right? So even if on the surface it looks simple, the formula, the information that's going into getting your company an ESG score or weighting or grade, however they do it, that can be used by entities looking to make decisions based off of this information, is extraordinarily complicated, complex, time-consuming. And that's why it's really important that you get it right, because although it's complex and time-consuming and a bit of a pain, it's really important in today's business environment that you're thinking about this if you want to retain or establish a competitive edge over your peers. So this is all to say that, yes, ESG is out there. There's no agreed upon definition. And even when there is an agreed upon definition, the way that data gets out there varies depending on the organization you're working with, which of course makes the whole thing quite a challenge. And if we had to add one more challenge to the pile of challenges, which I'm going to here, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So finally, you've determined, okay, this is what we think about ESG. These are the organizations we're going to work with. Now you need to understand that ESG from company to company looks different. Even if you are on the same stock exchange reporting to the same things, what ESG actually means to your organization and to your stakeholders varies depending on what type of company you are, where in the world you are, what industry you're in. So here we have another a clip from MSCI's website, which shows a filter where you can see all of their categories. So these are all 36 of their categories that I showed earlier, but this is focusing on only the automobile manufacturer sub-industry of ESG. So I figured this one's applicable, right? I'm sure many people on the call, most of them probably own a car and drive now and then, so we can all relate to what it takes to manufacture that automobile. You can see that when we define ESG for automobile manufacturers, MSCI determines that on the environmental side of things, items like product carbon footprint, opportunities in clean tech, and toxic emissions and waste are really the key criteria that feed into your overall score. So they do it on a percent basis. You can see product carbon footprint there at 15.8% and opportunities in clean tech at 13%, which realistically means EVs in this case. That's how an automobile manufacturer is graded, and that's how their ESG score is put together. Things like raw material sourcing, interestingly enough, don't show up as a weighted category. On the social element, of course, we know that producing cars, quality may be the biggest focus because that can lead to liability down the line, loss of life for the millions of people that buy a car. So product safety and quality, imperative when it comes to the social part of your score, as is labor management and chemical safety, and then governance. They went pretty generic here. But this is to show that for automobile manufacturers, ESG looks like this. So what if we looked at food retail? We all drive cars, or most of us drive cars. I bet we all eat food on the call. So let's think about a food company and what ESG means to them. Product carbon footprint on the environmental side, the biggest one, but less so than the automobile manufacturers at only 7.9%. In this case, we see a big focus on raw material sourcing. This is to say that you are getting materials in a sustainable way, not destroying, swaths of land in the Amazon or anything like that to do this, and then toxic emissions and waste. On the social element, we have a lot more categories factored into the score. So not only is it product safety and quality, of course, imperative for food, but we also have privacy and data security. We have opportunities in nutrition and health. That makes a lot of sense, as well as supply chain labor standards and human capital development. Interestingly enough, that little CS widget or indicator there next to supply chain labor standards, that means that it's company specific, CS company specific, to say that different supply chains have different labor standards and have different rules. So MSCI in this particular case will look at your company's operational characteristics to determine how that actually factors into your score and what your weighting should be. So again, this is all to drive home the point that ESG is a very broad concept in which there is no locked-in single-use definition, and that even when you do land on a definition, what ESG means to your organization and your industry changes. So it's really cognizant for people to be aware of this. Here's an example from SASB, an organization which you can voluntarily report to get a sustainability score. This is really small text. I don't expect anyone to be squinting at their computer monitor reading this, but this is to, again, show the materiality of different items when it comes to sustainability scoring. You can see the different colored boxes here in gray. So darker gray means it's more material. What I did with the red boxes here is go around the categories that are more important to the folks on today's call. So I circled GHG emissions, air quality, employee health and safety, and incident management, thinking about catastrophic incidents like the train derailment in Ohio right now, for example, or Deepwater Horizon type incident, which is a critical failure, but a health and safety or environment related failure as well. So you can see in industries such as, let's say, food and beverage, GHG is important, but critical incident, critical risk management, maybe not so important. And employee health and safety comes in of medium importance. Over on the extraction and mineral processing side, a notoriously dangerous industry, employee health and safety is much more material to the resulting sustainability or ESG score from SASB. Again, just to show the variation in what's important depending on what industry you may find yourself in. So when thinking about how to define ESG for your specific organization, there's a couple questions you need to really ask yourself. Who are your stakeholders? Meaning, who cares about this information? Who wants to take a look at it? Who wants to make decisions based upon it? And then on the internal side, who's going to be responsible for providing this data or creating this output where these external stakeholders can use it to make decisions? We'll get a little more into that later, but when thinking about what does ESG mean for me here in ABC Corp, wherever you may be, who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? Second, what data do they expect and how do they expect it? So are they going to want to know all about your employee health and safety practices? Are they very, very focused on your carbon footprint? And do they expect that in the form of a corporate sustainability report? Do they expect that in the form of an Excel file? Are they going to be mainly making decisions based upon your company based on MSCI's score or S&P Global's score for you, or the Sustainalytics/Morningstar score, or the Refinitiv score? There's a number of ways or organizations out there that can provide this information to your ultimate decision-making stakeholder. So thinking about the stakeholders involved, how are they most likely to receive that data, and how can you use that to your benefit or make sure that you're giving them the data that they need based on how they're accessing it? Number three, what are your peers doing? Right now, I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are at varying levels of maturity when it comes to their ESG program setup. So especially if you're kind of in the early stages of your journey, you're just beginning the development of this program and understanding what data you have and et cetera. We'll get more into that later. But it's always helpful to just look around at your peers. So look at those in your industry, see if they have reports on their website, see if they're using this type of language, see if they've set specific goals, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to be doing something super duper different than what everyone else is doing in your industry. That's probably a bad sign. But you always want to look to that for guidance and see if you can improve on what's already been established. Number four, what are your stated goals? What about your values? So as you think about how you want to message ESG to the outside world and the inside world, your employees, have you already stated certain goals in terms of we want to reduce carbon emissions to a 1990 level by 2030, or we want to reduce carbon emissions 20% a year based on a baseline year of 2015? And we've already said this, maybe you haven't, committed to it, but you've kind of been saying it and towing this line for a while. Think about that. Also think about what the values at your organization are, right? I'm not sure everyone on the call could immediately spit off their company's values if they were, asked about it in an elevator, but chances are your company does have actual concrete values somewhere on their website or in the facility, et cetera. So think about how ESG and ESG goals, more specifically, may align with the values that you've set at your organization about being good stewards of the community, for example, or, it doesn't have to be environmental related, remember. It can be focusing on employee well-being and work-life balance, or it could be supporting the communities in which we operate by providing more opportunities for the youth or something. There's such a broad array of things that could be filed under ESG, which is why I'm talking to you today about the problems that creates for us all. But think about how your approach to ESG can reflect the kind of messaging that your company has been using, maybe for 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. It could be anything like that. So make sure you're keeping that in mind. And then our final point here, what is material to those outcomes? So if you have a goal for reducing carbon emissions, or have a goal for reducing wastewater, or have a goal for educating young people in your community or something, what can you actually do that is material to achieving those outcomes and achieving those goals? Alternatively, what can happen that's material to you not achieving those goals or not being able to do what you said you would be able to do? It's really important to understand what actually matters to your organization in terms of what ESG is to your organization. So thinking about the materiality map I showed there from SASB, that's one example. We'll talk about more examples in a little bit here about ways to think about what matters to the outcomes that we expect of our company, of ourselves, and what our stakeholders expect of our company. So that's an overview on how to define ESG for your organization. Let's jump into agenda item number 2, tools and techniques to drive smarter ESG decisions. Now that we've established ESG as a broad concept with some commonalities used for decision-making mainly that varies industry by industry, how can you, the leader of ESG or EHS or sustainability or maybe HR or corporate communications in your organization, make fact-based decisions on ESG? Because we've established it's a bit of a subjective world, right? And I know that was in the abstract I created for this webinar, that this is all meaning different things to different people, depends on where you are, depends on your background. So in this very subjective world, why it's best to use objective data to make specific decisions. So first off, we've talked a lot about stakeholders. Let's talk some more about it. Obtain data on stakeholder issues. So when you're structuring your approach to ESG, thinking about how you want to message, thinking about what data you want to collect, thinking about who's going to use that data, thinking about why they're going to use that data and what they expect to see within the data, thinking about how you as an organization can get data and then improve data, aka improve your performance to meet your goals. What do the stakeholders actually care about? So I've highlighted 4 key ways in which to answer that question, hopefully in an objective way. 1, these are varying levels of objectivity, by the way. The first is desktop research, right? So this is simply, hey, we have to create our ESG strategy. I'm going to sit down on my computer or have my team sit down on their computers and look around and try to define exactly what ESG should mean to us, why, and what that means for our program moving forward. So the pros of this method are, of course, it's fairly cheap, right? You're just having your current employees do this work on their day-to-day. Fairly easy. There's a lot of information out there on the internet, a lot of, especially with the buzz, the focus on ESG right now, there will be a lot of literature that you can read about, pull up from a variety of organizations. And, that speaks to my third point there. There's multiple sources available. The cons are, depending on the expertise of the person or people performing this research, the actual accuracy and usability of the information acquired may be low. It also may not be very specific. The big problem here is that it's going to be static. Whenever the team goes out and gets this research and brings it back in and, hey, here's what ESG means to our organization right now, that's a point in time assessment. You can, of course, commit a person to be doing this on a regular basis, focus on this as their singular job. But most of the people responsible for ESG execution have other things that they're also responsible for. So this is going to be static. And then finally, this is a big one. There's going to be bias involved. We all have bias, right? It's human nature to have bias in a variety of ways. So depending on what we think is important to our stakeholders, oh, of course they care about my carbon footprint. Of course they care about my ethical supply chain. They very well may, but we're going into that thinking we already have the answer to the question that we're trying to ask, which can lead us to confirm what we think we know, aka confirmation bias, meaning that you're not actually answering the question correctly. You're just answering in the quote unquote easier expected way. Second, surveys. So this is a very common one. And a lot of software companies are going to offer this survey capability in which you can send out a survey to your choice of selection of potential stakeholders and see what they're caring about it. So hear it right from the horse's mouth. This is quantitative. That's good. It's direct. It's primary research. That's great. The cons, again, this is static. You may send out a survey every year. You may send out a survey every 5 years. This is going to be a fairly long survey that goes out to a lot of people if you really want to have good data. So this isn't something you just shoot off every week or every month or every quarter, right? It's time consuming to wait for the responses to come in. It's time consuming to build the survey in the first place. And then you may not know what to ask. If you are just architecting your ESG program for the first time, or even maybe you're going through its first pivot, you might not know the right questions to ask to really find out what these stakeholders care about. Again, this is going to be open you to confirmation bias, thinking I'm going to ask them questions that I think I know the answer to, but let's confirm their assessment. Let's confirm that they do care about carbon. You may miss an issue that they care about altogether, not leaving them any room to voice their concerns or opinion or interest in an issue when it comes to ESG. So while better than desktop research, there's a lot of problems with surveys. Third, software. So I mentioned that a lot of software gives you survey capability, but it's even better to have software that can do the assessment for you, right? This is time consuming, there's questions to be asked. So when you think about software, and we'll talk about a specific company a little later on, you want this to be crawling the web in an automated way to bring you the concerns specifically of external stakeholders. If it's simply an algorithm that's looking for companies like yours in your industry, trying to figure out what the collective ethos, the world is saying about ESG when it comes to your organization, this is going to be unbiased, it's going to be pretty efficient, and it's going to be dynamic. That's the key here. Because this is an automated approach, it's not just going out and doing a survey every 3 years. It's not just doing desktop research once every year or 2 years when you're reviewing your high-level strategy, your organization. This is something that essentially, with the click of a button, you can redo again, right? So that's awesome. The con here is that compared to surveys or desktop research, of course, software may be prohibitively expensive depending on the budget allocated to this function at your organization. Now, I put in parentheses versus consultants because versus consultants, it's not going to be expensive. Actually, consultants are often very, very expensive. So it will save you money versus consultants, but make it cost you money versus doing it the survey and the desktop way. And then, of course, finally, if you say, look, Trevor, this is great, but I need answers to these questions, and I simply don't have time to do it myself, whether that be going out and implementing a software or creating a survey or even doing desktop research, there's plenty of consultants out there ready to sign a check and take the money and do this work for you. And they do great work, of course. This saves you internal time. These are experts doing this work, so they're going to be able to do the analysis for you and give you a really nice output that can guide you in a direction. That's the role of a consultant in any business function, ESG included. The con, again, this is probably the most expensive route to take. It's going to be static because you're doing one project. Keep in mind, too, if you spend a bunch of money on doing this project at one point, it may be extra static because you may not have the money to redo the project in the future. And when we're having humans do any work, there is going to be bias involved. So depending on what they've seen from other companies, what they've seen from peers of yours in your industry, there may be some bias in what the output they deliver to you, and it may not be exactly tailored to your organization in the way that you want it to be. Remember, it's very important that it's tailored to your organization because ESG is so broad yet varied depending on where you are, what you're doing, how you're doing it, who you're doing it for, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we're going to obtain data on stakeholder issues. Second, it's important to set correct baselines. A lot of ESG is goal setting. This is extra important when we think about rules coming from the likes of the SEC, where they're holding folks to account based on their stated scope 3 goals, for example, something maybe many ESG managers didn't think they'd be held to account for. But I digress. Set correct baselines. Think about if there were any anomalies affecting production, costs, emissions, etc. So if you were going to set your carbon emissions baseline based on 2020 and 2021, you might want to rethink that decision because carbon emissions from your company may have been a lot lower considering production cuts, supply chain issues, etc. from COVID, right? So that's a really bad year to set your baseline on. You're setting yourself up to fail. So when setting baselines, think about what nominal, truly normal operations look like because that should be your baseline. Second, does your company's operational profile look different than it used to? Will it look different in the future? So when you set a baseline based on, we're just going to be 2010 through 2020, think about the growth that was experienced in that time. Think about the future strategy for your company moving forward. Are you anticipating moving into a completely new region of the world? Are you going to open new plants? Are you creating a new product that will lead to a different way in which you produce things or more emissions or something? So think about when setting a baseline, is this baseline going to make sense for us 5 years from now, considering where we were 5 years ago? Again, this is all in the spirit of not setting yourself up for failure and creating ESG targets based on objective, intelligent data that you already have access to. but you may have access to it. Are you confident in it? You can say, oh, well, I think based on what we know, this was our carbon emission, this was our carbon footprint on an average basis from 2016 to 2019. How confident are you in the data that you're using to make that decision or set that baseline? Were you really gathering it from everywhere? Was this just people entering things in Excel? Could there have been any data quality or hygiene issues? Was this direct from the source, from like a continuous emissions monitoring system on a stack, or is this just estimations based on your electricity bill, for example? How are you getting that data, and how confident are you in it? Because you are very likely to be held to task from a regulatory body on meeting goals you've set as per baseline data. So make sure you're pretty confident in that data being correct when you start off with it. Does this align with mandatory regulations, which is something I just touched on? Is this going to be compliant with what future regulations may be out there, of which there are plenty? I'm not going to spend too much time today on this webinar talking about that. There's thousands, probably millions of pages of literature and other folks doing that research. So I encourage everyone to stay on top of that, of course, but make sure you're checking that when thinking about setting baselines. Does it align with baselines peers are using? So again, I always recommend people keep an eye on their closest friends, closest enemies, to understand what their baselines look like, what their targets look like. And then finally, once you've set a baseline, the whole point of setting a baseline is to improve upon it, right? So how will you measure improvements on this baseline? How do you have the right tools in place? Do you have the right people in place? Do you have the right processes in place to actually say here, hey, here's where we're starting from. Here's where we intend to be by 2025, by 2030, by 2050. Here's how we're actually going to measure that. And we're going to be confident in what that data says because X, Y, and Z. So consider what happens after the baseline is set. And then next up here, keep sights on a moving target. We talked about how to identify what your stakeholders care about. We just talked about making sure you set objective, intelligent, smart baselines. But ESG is a moving target. Here's an illustration of what I mean. I have a couple, but here's the first one. This comes to us, well, the World Economic Forum top 5 global risks in terms of impact from Schroeder. So again, font really small. I don't want anyone straining their eyes here, but what this shows us is from bottom to top, the top ESG or sustainability issues from 2007 to 2020. The important thing to note is that green boxes represent environmental risks. So back in 2007, no light green at the bottom there. When we think about what ESG meant to the world at large, specifically the corporate world, it wasn't so much about environment. It was kind of more about technology. There was a lot of economic risk in 2007 and 2008. I think that rings true for everyone. That's not an unexpected result considering the financial issues in 2008 and 2009. But then as time goes on, AKA as we move up this chart, we see more and more environmental risks coming up. So on the left side is likelihood, on the right side is impact. Seems like we kind of started to get aware of the likelihood of these environmental risks earlier than we started thinking about the actual impact of them. But nonetheless, we see that thoughts on environment or how important environment is to the whole ESG picture was changing over time. And today, it really dominates what we think about when we think about ESG, which I think tracks. If I met you some random place and we started talking about ESG, our minds, both of us, would probably jump to things like carbon footprint, things like emissions, things, of that nature. Water use is a big one right now, considering the droughts all over the world. We'd think about environmental risks maybe first, and then we'd talk about things like societal or economic or geopolitical should be making a re-entrance maybe into the top risks here. But nonetheless, what ESG means, again, changes over time. So here's another example, and I've taken these two charts from a company called Datamaran. Datamaran is one of the software companies there that uses an automated algorithm essentially to look at the core ESG issues or external ESG risks for your company over time. This is where you can, click a button and basically have this produced for you so you can make sure that you're managing the things that your stakeholders expect you to be managing. So I asked them actually to do this analysis explicitly for presentations where I talked about ESG being a moving target. So what we see here is on the left, emerging priorities, or the top 5 topics most increasing in emphasis in the past 5 years, specifically for the European food and beverages sector. This is to say that the assessments are very, very granular, right? We can see public health risk shooting up in 2020. Of course, that's related to COVID. But we also see things that aren't so related to COVID, right? Biodiversity Medium risk in 2018, it actually dipped down low, and now it's been going back up in terms of importance to your ESG management strategy. Things like human rights has been slowly creeping up. Let's see, we have everything's kind of creeping up in a sense, but climate change risk and management again dipped down in 2018, but coming back up, and I think that'll be up in a big way. On the right, we have the top 5 general EHS related topics per latest disclosure. So while much of ESG relates to EHS, which I'm going to spend a lot of time on later, that chart on the right is just focused on the EHS parts of ESG. So these are things like greenhouse gas emissions, inclusive workplaces, non-hazardous waste management, water, etc. We can see things kind of staying the same, except greenhouse gas emissions, unsurprisingly, being a bigger issue than other things, because again, this is one of the focuses of ESG. So all to say, again, ESG, moving target, dynamic, changes over time. Thinking about what it means to your organization, but make sure you're thinking about that question on repeat. Don't just think about it now. Don't just think about it when you log off this webinar. Think about it in 6 months. Think about it in a year. Think about it in 2 years from now, because the answer, what does ESG mean for my organization? What are my stakeholders expecting me to do when it comes to ESG management, is going to change. That's an answer to a question that's always going to change. And if you take away anything from what I say today, I want you to take that away. Okay, so the final thing to do when we're thinking about making smart, objective, data-based decisions for your ESG management is to consider your entire tech stack. So I come to you from an EHS/ESG software company, right? So of course I'm going to say, if you really want to manage your ESG program efficiently, effectively, and improve your metrics over time, you're going to need to have EHS and ESG software. Sometimes that's the same software, sometimes it's 2 different tools, but nonetheless, those are imperative to tracking your KPIs, assigning tasks, finding trends, finding hotspots, et cetera, et cetera. But ESG is broad. This is another thing I've been saying today. It's a very, very broad concept. So the data that goes into reporting ESG is realistically not going to come just from these 2 types of software. You also need to consider things like carbon program management software, right? So while EHS software, ESG software may be able to manage your carbon emissions and report on them, managing a whole carbon program can sometimes be trickier when it comes to things like buying offsets, for example, which is functionality not often found in EHS software. ELeader does have some, but there are dedicated solution providers out there that do things like carbon program management, which bring that holistically into one tool. So if you're very focused on carbon, it may be smart to think about carbon program management software. Other items that will influence and maybe provide data to your ESG management program and ultimately ESG rating providers, GRC software. So now we're looking at the governance specifically part of GRC, the corporate compliance, this is ethics violations, this is whistleblowing. Those all matter when it comes to an ESG score. Next up, we have things like HR or human capital management, aka HCM software. This is going to be on diversity of your workforce and equitable pay, things like that, turnover rates, satisfaction, within engagement within the workforce, all can be factored into your ESG performance and ultimately your ESG score, which gets used by those stakeholders. And then finally, we have even things like risk and materiality management. This is where we think about data moran, right? Providing that materiality assessment that kind of informs your ESG program at large. So consider the full tech stack. Not only consider the different types of tools that you may need to have or make sure you already have or need to go out and search for, but really the holy grail is thinking about how these softwares interact together. You need to make sure that data can be pretty seamlessly transported between these tools, especially on the ESG reporting side, where it's typically organized and ready and prepared for distribution to the stakeholder, the rating agency, the regulatory body that needs this data. Think about how data can move around within all these systems, how they're used across your workforce. And of course, I put and more because I wanted to make this nice and aesthetic and symmetrical, so I used 6 bubbles. But there are, of course, more softwares that may play a role in managing your ESG program holistically. So that's really, really important to think about. You want to do this right. You want to use actual data. You want to find actual trends. You want to make real improvements. Make sure you have the right tools in place to execute on all those very lofty, difficult to achieve goals that you're setting. Okay, and our final agenda item here, how ESG is changing the roles and responsibilities of EHS professionals. So Thus far in my presentation, we've talked about what ESG is, what it isn't, how it's defined in general. We've talked about how the definition of ESG differs depending on your type of company, your industry, your region, etc. We've talked about if you want to manage your ESG program effectively, you need to take in a variety of considerations and make sure you have a variety of tools in place so you're making smart, objective ESG decisions and not doing it just by the seat of your pants. But who's going to be responsible for a lot of these programs? That's the EHS team. In fact, I believe recent data from Verdantix said 44% of EHS departments have complete ownership over ESG management, including setting the goals and executing the goals. So really imperative that we understand how ESG is changing the role of an EHS professional. Now, you may think, okay, I'm going to just talk to you about this, but I really want to show you that this is not just me saying this is coming from actual job descriptions. So for example, on the left, we have the Director of Global Environment, Health and Safety job at Textron. This is a clip from a little bit ago, so I doubt this job is still open, but this Director of Global Environment, Health and Safety, a title probably some of you have on the call today. Part of the job description, building bench strength and leadership potential within the EHS teams while driving people to develop and implement global programs and achieve strategic priorities, coordinate with our EHS teams to drive progress, achieve our 2025 goals regarding not just safety, but also sustainability. Not only just sustainability like air emissions, things like energy usage reduction, waste reduction, and resilient facilities. This is expanding the scope of the EHS professional's job. And the relation continues there. In the middle, we have a Director of Sustainability job, which talks about all the normal things you'd expect that job to talk about. But that role reports into the Vice President of EHS, meaning the EHS department fundamentally has oversight over what's going on when it comes to sustainability within an organization. And this isn't just a North American thing. On the right side, I took a job description from a job in Leeds over in the UK, a site level safety and health and environment manager, a site level person that has responsibility for, in that red circle, reducing the site's environmental impact in the areas of chemical oxygen demand, hazardous and non-hazardous waste, SOx and CO2 emissions, and water and energy consumption. The site safety, health, and environment manager is having responsibility for executing on goals related to sustainability, which is a big subset of ESG. So this is increasing the scope of EHS professional jobs. That's really important to understand. So how is it actually changing the job? When we think about before ESG was all the buzz, when we think about before we logged into LinkedIn and saw half the page being ESG articles, EHS professionals were very focused on compliance, focusing on avoiding unnecessary costs like fines, penalties, violations, etc. Avoiding shutdowns related with massive accidents, which hinder output. Think about training your employees on what they need to know when it comes to safety, and then collecting and analyzing, health and safety metrics. The visibility here was that, hey, some metrics go to board level. You have some of the high level metrics going to the C-suite. Depending on the maturity of EHS at your company, you may have had a direct, as the VP of EHS, for example, you may have had a direct line into the CEO or COO where you reported on the metrics. But nonetheless, it's kind of, hey, let me know what's going on here. Make sure nothing catastrophic is happening. Are we seeing some sort of massive increase in injury rates? But as long as everything's mostly nominal, everything's looking flat or down across the board, that's all. I don't need to know the nitty gritty. We just want to make sure we're doing a good job. ESG is really turning that on its head because you have all of those responsibilities that you used to have, but now you have ensure comprehensive and accurate collection of ESG metrics, of which we've established are many and varied and complex and different depending on your industry. Streamline the path from raw data to reportable data, and not just reportable data, reportable data that may very well be scrutinized to the same level that financial data is scrutinized. So this really needs to be clean. And that's another thing I want to emphasize. This data isn't just going into a sustainability report that's posted on your website for socially conscious investors to read, and that's great, and they can make decisions. This is data that the SEC may very well come after you to make sure is correct, audit you, fine you if it's not. And then finally there, create and manage initiatives to improve material ESG metrics. So you're going to be thinking of the broader strategy for what ESG means to your organization and how you can improve based on what your stakeholders want to see. What does that mean for visibility? Well, it means that you are now much more visible, right? Senior leadership is more aware of ESG data coming from the HSC or EHS function because it's more material to the overall business performance. If any of you were to tune into CNBC after the conclusion of this webinar, you may very well see some sort of CEO of an organization or senior leader talking about ESG at their company, talking about their carbon footprint, talking about what their goals and initiatives are, because you have people with capital coming to them and asking them. And look, these people are by no means experts, a little foreshadowing there, on what they should be doing when it comes to ESG, but they know they're getting asked about it. And if they're getting asked about it, that means that they're going to ask people within their company who know it hopefully better than they do what they should be saying, what the messaging is, what the goals they're setting is. They want to look like experts when they're on, CNBC, for example. So that's why all of a sudden the EHS function is much more visible. You have a role to play in the actual strategy, the actual value created for an organization. A common phrase that I've heard ever since I was in school to learn how to be a health and safety professional is that EHS is a cost center. Well, if people are making decisions with billions of dollars based on ESG metrics, EHS has just moved from a cost center to something that legitimately and tangibly creates value to the organization if you do in fact have responsibility for ESG performance. It is no longer a cost center. It is something where you excelling at your job and meeting your targets can create shareholder value and stakeholder value for your organization. That is an incredible opportunity, in my opinion, for health and safety professionals and the broader, even yet, the profession of health and safety across the globe. So just an example, an illustration here that kind of shows this. EHS and ESG overlap significantly. This is going back to our friends at MSCI. This is another visualization of the categories that they have that make up the environment, social, and governance pillars of their ESG scores. This particular one is highlighted to show the key issues for the metals and mining non-precious category. So this is to say a very dangerous one where health and safety and environment considerations are kind of the focus. You see how many things there the EHS team is going to have authority over. So carbon emissions, biodiversity in some cases, toxic emissions, of course, and waste, labor management, health and safety management. When it comes to metals and mining, ESG, for all intents and purposes, is EHS, right? So that's really core to understand. Now, here's the kicker. Harvard Business Review analyzed some research from PwC, so it was kind of a meta review of research, and found that of 1,188 Fortune 100 company board directors, only 29% had listed relevant ESG expertise. This means that the people being asked about ESG, the people that are having to talk about it on TV, the people that are reporting to the shareholders on the earnings call about ESG aren't experts, right? They don't necessarily know what they're doing. So they're going to lean on people that do. And that's you, the EHS professionals of the world that have been managing data like this on health and safety, on carbon emissions, on toxic emissions and waste for your whole careers. This is the mandate of the EHS professional. So a lot of this data already exists. A lot of this expertise already exists, but now there's a whole new forum, a whole new arena in which this data is more critical than it's ever been. These leaders are going to be coming to the EHS teams to help them nail these strategies, to help them execute on their goals. I encourage all of you to take advantage of this opportunity to raise the profile of EHS, raise your individual profile within the organization, because this is an opportunity like we haven't had in quite a long time. So that brings us to the question portion of today's session. I think I got through that. Apologies if I was speaking a little quickly there, but I wanted to make sure we finished within the hour and left an adequate amount of time for questions. So I will hand it back over to you, Jessica. Any questions coming up?
Well, yes, thank you for that. And we did have a question come in actually about ESG and triple bottom line sustainability. And to the individual who asked that question, this is actually a topic that we are going to touch on Friday when we have our roundtable. So I'm not going to let Trevor answer that question quite yet, but we will be talking about it later on. Now, you spent some time at the beginning of the presentation talking about surveys. Can you share some best practices for surveys that you've seen or you've seen implemented, or maybe some too that aren't great ideas for surveys? You look at data all the time, so we'd love to get your feedback.
Yeah, sure thing. So surveys are tricky. They can be very effective, but they have to be done right, because inherently when everyone should go into their email right now and look how many surveys they have from products they bought, looking for customer feedback, right? I think most of us generally gloss right over them. So if you're going to send out a survey to your stakeholders, you need to make sure it's relevant. You need to make sure it's simple enough to not be daunting where they avoid it, but comprehensive enough that it's going to give you actual data, which is what makes that approach to determining what your stakeholders really care about a little tricky when using survey approach. But if you're going to go the survey approach, you want to do an internal workshop where you think about exactly the type of people that should be receiving the survey, right? So let's kind of do a pre-think about who our stakeholders actually are. And I encourage you to cast a wide net. Don't limit this. At this point, you're just trying to gather as much data as you can to make an objective decision. 2, think about the questions you're actually going to ask. Again, you need to find that sweet spot between comprehensive and simple, but think about what issues exist out there, whether you think, again, there's going to be a bias. Of course, they're going to want to know about carbon. So you want to put in a note about carbon, but you may want to discover some things that you aren't thinking that they're thinking about. So make sure they have the options to answer whether it's a drop down of 40 different options, or maybe you give some free text space where they can write in issues that can make your internal ESG team think. And then follow up. Surveys are always tricky, right? If you send out a survey, make sure you follow up that week, maybe a couple of days after. If the survey is open for 2 weeks, so they get a reminder 2 days before the survey ends, because you want to maximize engagement, because doing this is a bear, and it can be a costly use of resources internally, not so much that you're hiring new people, but you're taking your time away from doing your normal day job, right? So that is an expense. It's just a harder one to quantify. So make sure you're getting value out of the survey when you're doing it. Of course, I work for a software company that can facilitate surveys, but there's plenty of, SurveyMonkey can facilitate surveys too. So just making sure you're using something that makes it easy to gather that data, analyze it, share the data, make decisions based upon the data. So just kind of, what am I really saying here? Do your due diligence before you set up a survey. You get one shot. So make sure it's thorough, it's comprehensive, it's put together intelligently. Maybe you want to have a call with a peer of yours that's done this before, so you do it right. That's what I would say for best practices of surveys. Oh, I think you're muted, Jess.
I am muted. Thank you very much. Sorry about that to the attendees. No problem. I love how you ended that with, reaching out to a peer, because transparency is huge. It's great to learn from each other. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Everybody's time is very valuable, and the more that you can do in an efficient manner, it's going to benefit you, your company, your entire organization. So thank you for ending with that. What are some of the biggest questions that you get from clients when, talking to them about their data and their data collection?
Everyone is a little confused. I think everyone knows that this is an issue that they need to address, right? And they know they need to address it sooner rather than later, because again, people are getting a lot of pressure about this from their higher ups, from their stakeholders, from just the public ethos at large. But companies are starting from such varying positions of maturity or data accessibility or the tools they have implemented, right? So that's interesting. Now, it's great that, and you just mentioned the whole peer thing. I mentioned peers a lot during my presentation. It's great that everyone is in a sense learning this together. Not to say that ESG is new, right? This is a slide I've used in other presentations that I didn't use in this particular one, but it's not new. Anyone on this call, the EHS professionals here, know that ESG in some form has been around for a while, whether that be called environmental sustainability, whether that be called ethical supply chain, whether that be called, and I see this as a question here, triple bottom line. It's gone by a bunch of names. It goes all the way back to at least the 1950s, I believe, when there was a book about the ethics of a businessman. It probably even goes back further than that. So the concept is not new, but the scrutiny is. The thought that you could get audited and fined for not having rock solid data on your carbon emissions, that's a new concept. That's something that people aren't familiar with. Or maybe even the more scary one, the fact that the SEC could come in and hold you to account for scope 3 goals that you set and didn't know people would be thinking you would actually meet. That's scary. So everyone's scrambling a little bit. So the top questions we get really are, hey, what data do people expect me to have? Who is going to use this data and how? And what is our gap between those two really big things? We also get a lot of questions on how to structure a program. People are looking for best practices. So I mentioned that the EHS team is often responsible, and that's very true. But because of the breadth of what ESG really means, that means the people that are contributing to ultimately the data that's packaged up and sent out or used for decision making, the stakeholders exist outside of EHS too. So does that mean you need a dedicated sustainability slash ESG organization, with a VP of ESG or sustainability that reports into the C-suite? Does that mean, for example, in the slide I showed that you have a director of sustainability that reports into VP of EHS? I worked for a company where the sustainability report was managed by the corporate communications department. So what does the right organization to actually execute on this look like for my organization? I think that's a really common question, of which there is no perfect answer, right? All we can say is this is how it's been done. This is who has the data. And that's why I think, and we've seen this is validated by research, EHS teams are a really big part of this, because this is a super duper data intensive exercise. More data related to ESG resides in the EHS department than any other department. That's why they often spearhead it. So to answer the question again, and rambling a bit here, but in fewer words, what data do I have? Who does that data need to go to? How should I structure my operations to meet those requirements? And how are those requirements changing over time?
I don't think you were rambling at all. I think you gave justification for each of those. So thank you. I think we only have time probably for one more question, but just a reminder, we're going to see Trevor again with us on Friday. So if you have other questions, please feel free to submit them as we are finalizing the scope of exactly what we're going to be discussing on the webinar, on the roundtable. So this question just came in a couple minutes ago. Can you share an example of operational risk management strategy?
I can do my best, because that's a very broad term. Operational risk, right? If you think about operational risk as it pertains to the EHS department, you may be thinking about control of work solutions. That's blackout, tagout, that's permit to work, that's shift management and all that. If you think about operational risk on a broader level, almost as enterprise risk, that is where ESG starts to factor in. In general, EHS risk starts to factor in, as well as things like risk of cyber incident or workplace compliance violations. So thinking about an example of an operational risk management strategy, I would just take into account the risks that are relevant within your organization. This is obviously an EHS/ESG focused webinar. But I think the question is up-leveled from the control of work stuff. I think this is more to understand what these risks actually, the EHS and ESG risks, mean to your broader operational risk portfolio. Right now is a tumultuous time to answer that question. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what do these risks actually mean? How do you score them against traditional financial reporting risks, or the risk, just general geopolitical risk, for example, right? Of having supply chain, having your supply chain be very globalized and operations that can be affected. Maybe you had a big distributor in Turkey, right? What do you do about that now? So thinking about ESG, you just want to understand the actual financial impact. Really, that's at the end of the day, that's driving the focus on ESG, the financial impact that your performance, your goals, etc., has to your company. That's a question that is being answered in real time. Of course, there are hundreds of studies out there trying to answer exactly the true financial correlation between ESG sustainability performance and stock price or revenue generation. Maybe a company that is in the upper quintile generates 10% more returns or something like that. So stay on top of that kind of thing so you can be smart. Again, the point of this webinar was to talk about objective ways to manage ESG. The more data you have in terms of the risk of not doing something or coming up poorly, the better. Stay on top of the research that's being produced every day by some really great organizations.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up today's event. So, Trevor, I do want to thank you for all of the information that you provided today. If you do have questions for Trevor or his team at ESG, feel free to reach out to them at any point, and hopefully you'll be able to join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern time for our roundtable where we wrap up the ESG week. So again, Trevor, thank you, and thank you to your team for helping us put on this webinar today. But again, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and at this point, I'm going to conclude our webinar.
Thanks so much.